Joyita is working as a professor and officer in charge of the Department of Palliative Medicine at Tata Memorial Hospital. And basically, she is a psychiatrist looking after palliative medicine department, and she is a expert in psycho-oncology in Tata Memorial Hospital. She did her training in India and UK regarding psychiatry. She did postgraduate diploma in palliative medicine from Cardiff University, which has really enriched many of our knowledge. 25 years of experience in psychiatry and 14 years of psycho-oncology and palliative medicine. Her clinical research interests are mainly psychosocial intervention in cancer patients, and I have seen many of her papers, very nice papers in various journals, and psychological issues in palliative care, coping strategy, early palliative care, and she is also an active member of quality improvement program. She is also director of International Psycho-Oncology Society, on the editorial board of Psycho-Oncology Journal, and she is executive member of Bombay Psychiatric Society, and publication and presentation are enormous. I think I have seen her in many of the national conferences, many of the international conferences, and given the presentation. So her presentation is always very, very practical, very, you really get a lot of insight when she presents. So we are looking after Joyita for your presentation.
So thank you so much, Sushma ma'am, firstly for doing this fantastic academic endeavor for our postgraduate palliative medicine trainees. Thank you for giving me an opportunity for being here today and sharing this particular presentation. So the job for me is actually approach to cancer patients with substance use disorder. Because we need to focus, I think I'll be focusing mainly on pain. So the flow would be that we need to understand a bit of neurobiology of substance use disorder and different terms used. We need to understand what are the challenges and misconceptions in managing patients with cancer pain who have a substance use disorder. We need to develop and enhance skills in caring for these patients, especially in palliative care and early palliative care. And there is a bit that we have to talk about prevention of diversion. So I will be focusing on the opioid use disorders in substance use disorders. Will not be covering SUDs, which are other substances like sedative, hypnotics, and alcohol. And I'm not going to focus on palliative care needs of patients with substance use disorders. So a little bit about understanding what is addiction and what is substance use disorder. So what happens is that we know that the mesolimbic dopamine pathway, mesolimbic dopaminergic pathway here from the VTA to the nucleus accumbens. VTA is the ventral tegmental area, to the nucleus accumbens is the final reward pathway, or the final common pathway for the reward system. So it involves the VTA with the nucleus accumbens. So whenever we do something great, you know, we have these natural highs because the brain has its own sort of addictive substances, your own substances. Like we have the endorphins, we have our own marijuana, which is anandamides, we have our own acetylcholine, and we get what is called as natural highs. But with drugs of abuse, what happens is that we go ahead, we bypass, they bypass the dopaminergic circuits and go straight to the dopaminergic receptors, and they cause a big rush of these release of substances in the brain and the reward system. So there's a huge dopamine release, and that causes an artificial high. So then if everybody takes substances, if all people take substances, do all become dependent, or do they all become addicts? So for that, we need to understand that there is the system of impulsivity and compulsivity. So, impulsivity and compulsivity. So in the impulsivity, the main circuits are actually the striatum area, the thalamus, and the prefrontal cortex. So for impulsivity, there is a loop which goes from the ventral striatum to the thalamus to the prefrontal cortex, which is the ventromedial prefrontal cortex that is here. So this is a striatum, the thalamus, and the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. So, you know, the striatum will have inputs from amygdala and the hippocampus. So we have a top-up approach and a top-down approach and a bottom-up approach. So any problems in loss of inhibition, so the cortex has to say no. If the cortex is not able to say no, and the ventral striatum is overactive, then we might have a substance dependence because we are impulsive and impulsively we take the substance. But once we take the substance, do we go on to this compulsive use that we see in addictions or substance use disorder? So what happens for a compulsive, which is basically for habits and obsessive compulsive disorder, the loop is the dorsal striatum, the thalamus, and the orbitofrontal cortex. And this is responsible for the habits that we have. And you know, in substance use, there is that habit, the drug seeking behavior, going to all lengths to buy that particular substance or get that particular substance. So somewhere there is a switch from this impulsivity to the compulsivity. And what happens is that there is there is a neuroadaptation from impulsivity to compulsivity. So when we are impulsive, how do we take drugs? Because we are impulsive, we may have an impulsive personality disorder and impulsivity in our personality, or we have a genetically dysfunctional reward system. So some people tend to more impulsive, they get into this hijacking, it goes hijacking from the ventral to the dorsal striatum, and it happens. And the main thing is, the faster the drug enters the brain, more is the reinforcing property. So if you have something which you take orally, it will take its own time. But if we take cocaine, snort cocaine, it is a huge rush straight to the brain. And then the amygdala and the hippocampus are involved in the memory and reward conditioning. So the brain remembers that this was an extremely pleasurable stimulus. So it will do that. And over time, the dopaminergic neurons will stop responding to the primary reinforcer, which is the drug, and it will be to the secondary reinforcers, which are the conditioned responses. So where we took the drug, where we in this bar, in this pub, who are with us, something which is associated with drug taking, any particular stimulus that gives rise to the compulsivity. And because I'm talking about opioids, we know that opioid receptors are all through the brain. They are also in the all through nociceptive pathway, all also in the limbic system, and they also affect the locus ceruleus. So they will. So anything that is a rush, which is in immediate release or intravenous or rapid onset oral form or rapid onset opioid formulations will give that rush, and there will be adaptation, but they can readapt to normal in absence of the drug, but then maybe we need to reinstitute to another opioid, and hence the whole system of drug substance use disorder. So these are the definitions that we need to know. What is important? So abuse, I take that alcohol, I just want to alcohol, but despite having blackouts, despite being caught into by the police, I still keep taking it despite adverse consequences. The tolerance, I take the alcohol, it slowly increases. Whatever one glass I was taking, that is not enough to get me that high. I have to take 2 glasses to get me that equal amount of high that I felt. If I don't take it, then I have these symptoms of tremors, restlessness, etc. If there is physical dependence, it's a neurophysiologic adaptation to a substance evident in a drug class, specific withdrawal syndrome. When happens is, suppose if I don't get that substance, or the substance, there's a reduction in dose, or somebody gives me an antagonist, but it may or may not reflect a substance use disorder, may not reflect addiction. What is addiction then? Addiction is a chronic neurobiologic disease with genetic, psychological, and social factors in which there is repeated use of drugs, which leads to neuroadaptation, and what we technically call as 4Cs, that there is a loss of control, there is compulsive use, which I described before, there are consequences despite the consequences, and there is craving. And this is the American Society of Addiction Medicine, American Pain Society definition. So now addiction, in order to get away from the pejorative terms associated, say addicts or addiction, they defined it as a substance use disorder, which is sort of meaning the same up as per the DSM-5, and that is a problematic use with impairment or distress in a 12-month period. There are certain criteria, at least 2 of those criteria have to be met, and these encompass hazardous use, impaired control, social impairment. What is pseudo addiction? Pseudo addiction is I do drug seeking behavior, but only because it is inadequate pain control. So it's not I'm addicted, I'm not getting enough pain relief. What is chemical coping? It's an opioid intake ranging from normal non-addictive use to total addiction, accompanied with destructive behaviors. What it means that it is on a continuum. We can just take normally, or we can just happen to have some problems and I take the substance in order to relieve my stress, or it can go up to a full range substance use disorder. Opioid use disorder is when the substance relevant is opioid. There are certain specifiers, and that is early or sustained remission on maintenance therapy and in a controlled environment. And there is these aberrant drug-related behaviors, which are people who will forge the prescription, steal or borrow. They will inject the oral preparations. They will tamper the preparations that are there. They will escalate the drug dosage, unscheduled visits, losing scripts. So these definitions are quite important. And we have heard a lot about the opioid epidemic, which was declared in the US in 2017, and it is a huge, big issue. These are the numbers: almost 63,000 overdose deaths have occurred by any form of opioid, as by the CDC. And so it was declared an emergency, but public health emergency and an epidemic, but there were various causes about that. So it is good to know and to learn from them. And the whole thing was it was about hesitancy in prescribing opioids to then over prescription of opioids. There are pharmaceutical companies brought in OxyContin, thought to be tamper-proof, but then of course people are quite smart, tampered. So they took it other than the method that they were prescribed in, they damaged it. By the time people realized, they did the risk evaluation and mitigation strategies, they built in the rules, and so there was decreased prescription, and these prescription opioid users then had to move on to illegal opioids. But that's in US. The rest of us don't have, these are some of the numbers. In India, substance use disorders are about 1.5 to 3% in the population as per the studies. And but the ones, this is in general population, but the ones who seek treatment, almost 41 to 43% will have some substance use, at least one, and there can be polysubstance use. What are the challenges that we face in our setting? Because patients who will have a substance use are less compliant, they are less engaged with treatment, they may have frequent emergency department visits, there's always the risk of overdose. And the whole concept that is from the patient's concept. What about professionals? The professionals' misconceptions are that because they're already on a substance, that is enough for the analgesia, but that is not true. Adequate analgesia is not provided by the treatment for substance use disorder. Whatever treatment that they're getting, it is not adequate analgesia. I'm talking about opioids here. And if anybody has a remote history of substance use disorder, is immediately going to be a relapse. Yes, there is a risk, but that doesn't mean that we deprive patients of getting this particular medication when they are in suffering with pain. Now, how many people have it's about 3 to 9% or almost 39% of alcohol. In one study for advanced cancer patients, they found it at 17%. They found 18% at non-medical use of opioids, but very important for us that 4% only had documented. And of 1,000 above patients, 6% underwent urinary drug screening because of there was some suspicion, and rightly so, because 54% tested positive. So what are the principles of management? One is we don't work in a setup with addiction services, but there is a lot of wariness about, you know, what used to be called as addicts. So the first thing is, and we also think that it is not possible in our setting, but as I said, there is a risk. So we need to identify that risk. Once we identify the risk, we need to assess properly. And the big pillars here in substance use disorders, especially with pain, we need to we need to follow. These are regimes. It has to be interdisciplinary and multimodal approaches that we need to consider. It cannot be that the opioids are the only mainstay of treatment. And there are two more pillars to this. One is about education, both for the patients, caregivers, and for the professionals working in this field, and also about regular documentation. So what are the principles of management? It is that we need to identify, as I said, because if we don't identify, we won't be able to go ahead. There is also that concept about chemical coping, which I said before, and it apparently seems about 40% of patients with substance use disorders may have a coexistent psychiatric disorders. And if we do not manage these, the substance use may continue. The goals of care will differ. For somebody with a substance use disorder, the goal may be recovery. Somebody who's got pain and substance use disorder and cancer patient, we need to, their goal may be functioning. And some patients who have a very inherent substance use disorder, have been to different addiction services, been on opioid substitution treatment, and now has a progressive disease, has progressive cancer, cannot be without that substance how much ever. So we need to maybe going into hospice, end of life. So we need to think about harm reduction, which is also there in substance use protocol. For an active opioid use disorder person, we need to think whether it is acute pain or chronic pain. And the principle is no opioids for non-malignant pain. When I'm talking about all this, please remember I'm talking only about patients with substance use disorder. And as I said, multidisciplinary collaboration is the mainstay. So between pain, palliative medicine, psychiatry, addiction medicine, other specialists, everyone, anesthetists, especially in post-operative, pre-operative setting, everyone needs to be involved. and it has to be multimodal. Opioids should not be the mainstay. And what are the multimodal? We always talk about non-opioid analgesics, non-pharmacological approaches. And what are at this point, let me tell you what are the non-pharmacological approaches that can be used. It could be the mindfulness based, cognitive behavioral therapy, biofeedback, relaxation techniques. These should be there. It's always going to be multimodal analgesia approach. And because patients are going to be different, it is going to be a structured, individualized plan. Now, it doesn't really happen for all patients that we see. 80% of our patients who we are prescribing opioids to will not have a problem, but 20% of patients may have some kind of risk. So how do we identify, and what do we need to identify? We need to identify whether they are actively using the substance, or they are at risk, or they are in recovery and they are on medication assisted treatment programs, also called as medications for opioid use disorders. So we need to take a thorough substance use history. And this is a very delicate matter, because obviously patients are going to be quite sensitive. Hence we need sensitive and defensive. Hence we need to be empathic and non-judgmental. We need to broach the topic asking about, oh, do you take any alcohol or caffeine or nicotine? So illicit substances first, going into illicit substances then very gently, and then use of over-the-counter prescriptions. And as I said before, for chemical coping, we need to understand if they have any coexistent psychiatric disorders. The different instruments for screen. So we need we know about cage. So have you had to cut down? Do you feel annoyed if anybody tells you? Have you had to, do you feel guilty about continuing use, or do you need an eye opener? And the cage aid means adapted to include drugs. The other screening, there are a few. Other screening is the opioid risk tool, which has these items, and then we can risk stratify into low, medium, high. There's also this screener and opioid assessment for patients with pain. This is a longer version. There is a 5-item version also. There are other items like addiction severity index. There is assist. There are quite a screening tools there, but these are the ones which are commonly used and very sensitive. For assessment, especially when we are not really if we haven't worked in addiction services, we may not think about that, but we need to look at especially the eyes, the skin, needle mark changes, needle marks on the skin, track marks, etc. And of course, for the whole systemic examination for liver and renal impairment and injuries that can have happened. For withdrawal system, for withdrawal checking withdrawal, there are scales, which is the COWS, which is clinical opiate withdrawal scale, which is can be used by nurses as well as physicians. There is also the SOWS, which is subjective opiate withdrawal scale. So before we go in for this in the next 4 minutes, I just want to talk about what are the treatments for patients with opioid use disorders who are on medication assisted treatment programs. So what happens is they can have methadone, which you know, which is a full mu agonist, usually between 60 to 120 milligrams a day. This takes care of the craving 24 hours. They have to attend a treatment center daily for getting this one dose. How it is started, this is what is the Assam guidelines. In India, how it is started, we have either, they usually do the liquids, so it's 5 milligrams per ml. They start about 20 milligrams and then they gradually titrate, and gradually titrate, and the maximum they have usually been, it's the same thing, 60 to 120, but in our experience it is usually 60 milligrams per day. In for buprenorphine, they have mainly the buprenorphine sublingual or buprenorphine naloxone, the buprenorphine implant, and buprenorphine injections also. In India, we have the sublingual buprenorphine only, which is again 8 to 24 milligrams, and a usual dosage is about 16 milligrams in our setting. The buprenorphine naloxone is also there, which are used in some cases. I don't think the transmucosal is there with us, I mean in India. And buprenorphine, they can provide analgesia for 6 to 8 hours, fewer drug interactions than methadone, and implants haven't come to us yet. For those who are working individuals, do not want any sort of highs with opioids or any risks that are there, naltrexone seems to be a very good option. It is a full mu receptor antagonist, and it can be given as 50 milligrams every day, which is done in our setting, or it can be given as 100 milligrams orally Monday, Wednesday, and an extra dose 150 milligrams on a Friday. And how we do it in India for substance use disorders, there are 3 main regional centers, which is AIIMS Delhi, KEM Hospital in Mumbai, and in the regional center in Manipur. And each of these centers will have 10 centers. Each of these main centers have 10 centers who they work with. And so throughout, there are quite a bit of provision of these drug treatment centers, and it's important to know them. So if suppose somebody is on, so we need, I told you that we need to find out whether patient is actively using, patient is in recovery on a treatment program, or they are recovered and now they are not taking. So we need to find out what, if they are on, if they are on treatment, that is in a program, if they are on buprenorphine, and if they have chronic pain. It seems there are different protocols, but there is no real consensus. We always have to identify between risk of relapse versus risk of uncontrolled pain. And what we give is a one-time daily dose, but that will not control the pain, and hence we may have to divide it into 2 to 3 doses. We know the safety of buprenorphine, that is, its ceiling effect, less QTC prolongation, fewer drug interactions. For if we are wanting to initiate, this is somebody who's already on treatment. If we want to initiate somebody who has a history of OUD and has taken buprenorphine before, or needs to be, so we can have to initiate it, but we need to initiate it only when they are in mild, when on in moderate withdrawal symptoms. If they are perioperative, there are 2 methods. The first few I'm talking about in an hospitalized setting. So what they advise, that you, if they're already taking buprenorphine for that medication or medications for OUD program, you continue the buprenorphine. You can use PCA and PCA for any other additional doses that we need to give, and multimodal approaches. So regional anesthesia, non-pharmacological approaches, non-opioid adjuvants, all need to be used. And the other one is you can use buprenorphine, continue, use NSAIDs, adjuvants, and give PRN opioids. For outpatient treatment, if we need to start, we have to collaborate with the opioid treatment provider. So whichever is the center, we need to do that. Also, it's important to note that the buprenorphine transdermal that we use, it's only for pain, and it is not for use for opioid use disorder. For those who are on methadone maintenance treatment, again on chronic pain, we have to again liaison with the addiction team is extremely important, both for buprenorphine as well as methadone. So again, if they are hospitalized, if they're on methadone, chronic pain, hospitalized, we have to continue the dose of methadone. but it will not be enough for analgesia through the day. That dose is actually for reducing craving for 24 hours. We need to divide the daily doses in three. If they cannot tolerate oral for some reason, we have to consider an IV PCA. We have to anticipate tolerance. There is always that hesitation that, oh, cannot give more opioids, but actually they have tolerance and they need more opioids. And we have to have additional dosage for additional pain with proper thoughts related to safety and interaction, hence more monitoring. Rapid dose titration, look for inadequate analgesia, so we need to titrate and we may need to give additional opioids. Now, because we know that anything that enters the brain fast will give that high, and these people have been on this program to reduce that, to reduce craving. So we actually we should avoid any rapid onset opioid formulations. So controlled release tablets, controlled release preparations, transdermal fentanyl could be used as any additional opioid. If suppose the person is on a methadone maintenance treatment and we don't know what the dosage is, it is better that we do it in a very safe manner and not start it not more than 40 milligrams per day and titrate it upwards. This is of course Western literature, but we will need to see the requirement, the pain relief required and the withdrawal symptoms before we can titrate it up, and of course all the other medications that are going to be there, because we're talking about methadone and hence QTC prolongation, etc. If somebody is on naltrexone and has pain, if naltrexone and they need a surgery, they have to be discontinued prior if they need opioids. If it is oral, we have to stop it 72 hours before surgery. If it is injectable, it will be 1 month before surgery. Naltrexone can be hepatotoxic, so we need to think about that. And of course, if it is unplanned and in an emergency, we must remember that the opioid requirement is like 10 to 20 times their usual opioid dose to overcome the blockade by naltrexone. And hence it is so important to be so very safe and liaising with the specialty teams. What if they are sort of actively taking an opioid, but it is not on, they're not on treatment, or if they are at risk of an opioid use disorder, because in one of those screening tools you will know whether they are at risk or not. So for these, as in principles of management, apart from liaising, multimodal, etc., we have to have a treatment agreement as to when would we visit, how many prescriptions will we give, what time do they have to come back to visit us, who needs to come with them, who will be given the prescription, what do we need to look for. So there has to be a proper, there are components of this treatment agreement, they're called opioid treatment agreements. We have to think of using non-opioids to full extent. We have to think of non-pharmacological measures. And if we have to use opioids, then that extended release preparations, and avoid rapid onset for opioid formulations. For reassessment, or for assessment and for reassessment, we know that the 4 A's that we have to do, it is analgesia, activities of daily living, adverse events, and monitor for aberrant drug-related behaviors, which I have said before. Close monitoring is extremely essential, and this is for the safety of the patient as well as for preventing diversion, which I will talk on for 2 minutes later. Education is very important for both patient as well as as well as family. Even for those who are not really actively using the substance or actively having any substance use disorders, it has been found that many patients won't know about safe storage and practice. So in a study, they found that 26% of the patients had unsafe storage. And this is very important because you may know the patient, you may know the one family member who comes to you, but you don't know the other groups the patient interacts with, and hence we need to be very careful. And also we need to get back things that we have to. So if you've given transdermal patches, we need to get back the transdermal fentanyl patches, because patients are, I mean, persons with substance use disorder are quite innovative. So they would have torn the matrix and taken it orally, torn the matrix and made it into injectable preparations and injected. So they do these things without being judgmental. We just need to know, and that would be in the agreement that this is what all we are going to do. And of course, needless to say, documentation is extremely important. Those who have recovered, we have to take into consideration their mechanism of pain. Many of these patients are very scared to go back to getting back on opioids because they have recovered now and wouldn't want a risk of relapse, understandably so. So we need to take their preferences in mind. We need to have a clinician opinion as to what is going to be important for them. If the patient prefers, then minimize the use of opioids. If opioids are necessary, we should use the lowest effective dose. And in all these cases, which I have missed out on saying, there has to be a proper discharge planning with a proper handover procedure from inpatient to outpatient to drug treatment and recovery programs. And also we need to advise them for continuing on or checking in on again in self-help 12-step recovery programs like Narcotics Anonymous, which are there in most of the cities, most of the places. For acute pain, again, we need to, the whole thing is about, again, actively on treatment or recovered. Then the patient preference, how much is the urgency? We need to have a comprehensive assessment. We need to have pain and addiction specialists. If we need to prevent withdrawal, methadone may be a preferred choice. We may need to use an intravenous patient controlled analgesia with monitoring. And once we stabilize the dose, we need to refer for opioid substitution treatment if they are at risk or taking. And we need to have community treatment plans. Now, all this is fine in pain, ambulatory cancer pain patient or pain patient with substance use disorder. We are talking about cancer pain. What happens in palliative care? It is we encourage them to attend recovery programs, other treatment centers, but it may be difficult for them because they are with advanced disease and not that ambulatory. We need to also have, they need to have frequent visits, which may not be possible. And what do we do about urinary drug screenings? That's not going to be possible for them. There was one bit that I have not, I think I have missed out previously, is we will talk about that in diversion, is that it's very important for us to have a social assessment of this, where they live, who is in the surroundings, are there people who are at risk or who are eyeing them. So there are these things that need to be looked at and that we can do in home-based palliative care services. Now, early palliative care gives a totally a few more cautions that need to be taken in, because now we know with advances in treatment, patients are going to be on immunotherapy, they are going to live longer, and if we start them on opioids or they are already on opioids, what do we need to do to avoid the risk or minimize the risk. First is we need to admit that there may be a problem. Second is that we need to understand the neurobiology, which we already have. So we need to screen patients. We need to, this is important in early palliative care because the disease modifying treatments may be giving, may cause the pain relief, and hence we need to taper and stop the opioid. So we should have mandatory visits planned for dose reduction and then gradual stopping if not required. We need to monitor for any aberrant behaviors. We also have to deal with, we do that for everything, but for early palliative care, it is important. And these are some pragmatic steps that are suggested. We should have psychosocial aspects looked at and alternative strategies. We need to be cautious with rapid onset formulations, education, state storage, which I've already said, in the context of interdisciplinary collaboration, and especially with the oncologists here in an early palliative care setting. There is so much of opiophobia, but we have to continue tackling that opiophobia amongst us also and amongst other people. For guidelines, there are guidelines, but a very specific one is this, which is of course chronic pain, and this is the SAMHSA, that is the Substance Abuse Mental Health Service Administration guidelines, which are there for managing chronic pain in adults with or in recovery from SUDs. A word about preventing diversion before we stop is, what is diversion? It is shifting legally obtained drugs into illegal routes or obtaining supplies illegally. So there should be a single point of prescribing, because these patients may go doctor shopping, multiple treatment centers, multiple dispensaries, and so we need to have safety measures for that. Give limited supply. What is preferred is a twice weekly prescription. We have to have proper handover with the liaison with out of hours provider. The home visit that I talked about as social context and family and friends which are there. So are there people around who might steal, who might use them for other purposes, who might be procuring them? It is important to tell the patients when we educate them that please don't go and announce that you have these 30 tablets or 40 patches, etc. We have to think about return of used patches, which we usually don't do, right? We just give them and trust people, but when there is a risk, we need to get back these. And after that, we need to do the collection back of all the drugs. So I don't think we have time because it's 7:15, but these were some two patients that I can remember wherein substance use and pain was a problem, both of them being on opioids. One was just taking opioid, the raw opium. The other one was actually on an opioid substitution treatment, and the whole principles of multimodal interdisciplinary studies. So before the residents ask me questions, I have a quiz for them. So we have these three, 1, 2, and 3. Can you tell me what each of these Sherlocks took for as a substance? Which substance did they take? You have 20 seconds. You can write on the chat. No one is writing, and we are on 16 seconds. Heroin, but who? Who had heroin? It's actually different. That's why I'm written. And these are such fictional characters. You'll have to tell me who. Nicotine. Who was the one? Nicotine. 2 was cannabis. Okay, that's 35 seconds. We have to stop. Okay. So you need to brush up on the Sherlock Holmes. So the first Sherlock is cocaine. And sometimes he did opioids, but he was not dependent. This Sherlock was nicotine because you would see him with 2 or 3 nicotine patches at the same time. And elementary Sherlock, famous for his opioid use disorder, injectable heroin actually, and he was in a full-fledged recovery program. So there we go. We have such fictional characters. So finally, substance use disorder, whatever we say, is always a risk. Although, some are at higher risk than others. We need to be alert. And what other pillars are an empathic approach, multidisciplinary, and a multimodal approach. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, ma'am. It was excellent presentation and a lot of insight into how we should be screening the patients and what to look for. So we do have questions, one of which is about screening of patients. So do we need to screen every patient for opioid use disorder? And if we find patients who are suffering from opioid use disorders or substance use disorders, should we triage this patient and prioritize them?
Actually, this is what we should be doing, because you see the 80% who will not have a problem and the 20% who will have a problem, unless if we ask, how will we know? So I think it is important to screen patients. And as we say, when we screen patients, it's not just about opioids, it has to be for other substances also. Because one of the risk factors for opioid use disorder is a history of alcohol dependence or any other gateway drug. So we need to screen. So ideally speaking, yes, we need to screen if we want to provide good quality service, because otherwise we'll miss out. And there's so many patients who come to us before time, so many patients who say that relief is not being controlled. So is it that we are missing something? So I think yes. Secondly, yes, if we do screen them, we have the tools, why not then risk stratify, and if we get the information, carry out the social assessment. If we know and if we know, then I think this is what we are learning. Rather than sort of isolated patients here and there, I think to make it a comprehensive service, we should be careful and alert and do it.
Yeah, there is a question in chat that do we need presence of patient to supply morphine, and should we insist on a live certificate?
Do we need patients to supply? Yes, because whenever the patient, when we have to when we have to give the prescription, we need to reassess them. And when we need to reassess them, we have to actually monitor for those 4 A's, and actually also have to do the opioid withdrawal system. So the opioid withdrawal checklist that we have to do. And yes, we need to see the patient. So if the patient can come to us, can we go to them? Of course, that is always going to be a limited supply. So yes, we have to see the patient. And what a life certificate meaning patient is alive. Yeah. So for patients who are, we are talking about diversion, and we need to be more extra careful about diversion. If we have to do that, we need to. But then how do we know that anything is authentic? So it's always better. And now with teleconsultation being all the rage, and I'm sure we will be able to see the patient even if they're not come to us. Because in this life, patients are alive is important, because many years ago it has happened that people have come and got morphine prescriptions, taken them away, and patients were deceased, right? So we need to be careful. It's not that, because we have to be ethically and legally responsible. We understand the patient suffering, but we also have to keep ourselves right.
Ma'am, there's a correction in this question. That's what they're saying, that live certificate for follow-up patients who are on morphine prescriptions in nowadays, like during the pandemic.
But if you, it's mainly because of the opioid use risk, isn't it? Opioid risk that they have. So if somebody on a high to medium risk and you are suspecting that they may be taking substances illegally, illicitly, only then. Otherwise, everyone will have to do that. 200 patients that we see every day will be giving certificates to everyone, but there is that prescription, so that is there.
I agree, ma'am. There's a question: if the patient is opioid dependent already, and we have a diagnosed case like that, and we want to wean this patient off opioids, how do we approach this patient then?
Well, so there must be a reason for opioid dependence, right? So you mean an opioid use disorder that they have.
Yes.
So when we are going to wean these patients off, it is best not to do it. Anything to do with the pain management as well as the addiction the substance use disorder treatment, it is best done in collaboration with the addiction psychiatry services, those who are doing that. It's not up to us. It is up, they have to have the primary responsibility, because it is a very formalized treatment registry based system, and they need to be documented. So we don't do that, because, or else we do that in collaboration, but the primary responsibility should be with the addiction psychiatry services.
Thank you, ma'am. Ma'am, there is a question, I think, which is very relevant to palliative care patients. If a patient with head and neck cancers is addicted to or dependent on nicotine, so these nicotine users, when they are not able to, leave taking nicotine, then how do we proceed in such cases?
So at the whole point about nicotine use and nicotine dependence, and as per the NCCN, that we need to have a smoking cessation or a nicotine cessation program. So if it is required, we need to do the nicotine replacement therapy. That is the first line. Nicotine replacement with varenicline, that is the next one, and nicotine replacement therapy with bupropion. These are the three which need to be done. The thing about nicotine is they do not give rise to crazy withdrawal symptoms, but what happens is the craving. And why? Again, it is because of the rush, because nicotine will enter the brain in a flash of a second, and that is the high, and hence it is more reinforcing. And if somebody hasn't had that patch, hasn't had that rush, it's a rush, it's going to be craving. And if they're not on a patch, it's going to be really, and we see that commonly in our patients, right? They get operated the day before they've had that. So we do use nicotine patches, and it's supposed to be.
Yeah, so that I think that applies to our palliative care patients as well, that we can,
Yes.
we can put them on a nicotine cessation.
Only thing is, nicotine patches are quite expensive. Nicotine chewing gum will not do for head neck cancers. So those are the practical. And the thing is that some people do quit quite well. And if they have quit for the last 6 months, there are less chances of them going back to it.
So, ma'am, is there any experience of yours with use of clonidine for opioid withdrawal?
Yes. Fortunately enough, I have worked, when I was an assistant professor in psychiatry, I have worked in this drug de-addiction service in KEM. So we would use clonidine for withdrawal, but that was obviously always in an inpatient basis with proper monitoring.
So what would be the dose of clonidine, ma'am, and how do we, should we start patients on clonidine? And
there are a rationale for when to use. So the first thing would be, so if there are, the first thing is to substitute, right? So reinstitute with another, which is the commonest thing done. However, if the sympathetic overactivity is way beyond, pulse, BP high, then, and it is not being managed with others. So we'll need to look up the protocol, and I'm sorry, I don't have it ready at the moment here. I'll find out and I can pass it on.
Thank you, ma'am. Ma'am, is there, so there is this question on, is there a referral center for Eastern India for substance use disorders?
The regional center in Eastern India is Manipur, and they have 10 centers under them, but I don't know the locations of all of them.
Yeah, so I think, ma'am, that answers the question. Now, there is one last question, which is there a time frame beyond which the risk of substance abuse increases in a patient?
So the thing is that the longer the person has been off the substance, the longer the readaptation has taken place. And if the readaptation has taken place well, then the chance of substance use will decrease. In the same way, the longer that the opioids have been taken, the longer the neuroadaptation continues, and hence the longer time it will be, even if it is in a treatment and recovery program, to come back to the near normal function. It may not be completely, and that is why it is important to continue on the OSTs for that. And why will it increase? It will increase because the disease might progress. That will cause the pain. We will need the opioids then, because it is there is a lot of pain. And along with that, remember, it is always the reinforcers that cause the major problem. So apart from the rush, then the receptors all change their profiles, and the reinforcers will cause the problem. So actually, so it's like once there is a risk, once there is it, we need to think about there being a risk at all times, even if it is, you did have people who've had remote history. That's why remote history is very important. So even if it is 8 years back, 10 years back, we still will be as careful as with our current history.
Ma'am, we still have 1 minute. So one last question on cannabis. So a lot of patients who come with, who have history of taking cannabis oil, or, or regularly taking cannabis. So those patients, what should we do? Like, how should we proceed with pain management? Does it influence our opioid prescriptions for such patients?
Right. Okay. So that is why I did the disclaimer that I am not doing anything other than opioids, but just to just as experience. So cannabis, the thing is that cannabis would be more. There's no intense withdrawal syndrome with cannabis. I mean, some bit is reported. It's because of the more psychological, so a little bit of irritability, etc. Now, it depends again on the patient preference. Obviously, it is helping them. Now, how is it helping them? Is it because of their perception? Is it because of an effect on mood? Or is it actually an analgesic effect? We will not know that. So it will have to be a dialogue with the patient. If somebody has been taking, out of their own field for the last 10 years, and now you tell them that, oh, don't take it, I don't know. So there needs to be a conversation about that. There's no, as I said, there are all these things. There are protocols only for that chronic pain, cancer pain. For each of the substances is nothing. The majority has been only on opioids.
Thank you so much, ma'am. I think we are done with questions. It was an excellent presentation. Very, it was actually an eye opener as to how to proceed with substance use disorder. So that is it. Thank you for participating. For the participants, we have almost like we had 100 participants, and thank you, Sushma ma'am. Thank you, Joyita ma'am, for the excellent talk.
Thank
Will-
you, Joyita.
Thank
It
you
was
so
an
much.
excellent presentation, and I think definitely there were a lot of apprehension and confusion regarding these patients, those who are on uh, opioids, and if they are on substance abuse, what should they do, how to handle those patients, and how to treat those patients. I think this was a very clear instructions from you. Thank you, Joyita. It was a great presentation.
Thank you
Thank you,
so much. My
Anuja.
pleasure. Thank
Thank
you.
you,
Thank
Geeta.
you. Bye.
See you on next Monday.